Yes, it's the one place to go where people go. That was my passion, but unfortunately, also balance making the music.
Thank you. We also have a feature every month called Skeptical Sidebar, where people talk about things that are... Well, now we know. When people talk about things and accept it. My intention today was to talk about the Bermuda Triangle, which I graduated high school in '76. My 11th grade history teacher explained that to me. It's been known that long that what's really going on there. But I kept seeing, and I saw on Bill Maher's program, the discussion. The Lancet has come out with a study that shows that natural immunity to COVID is as good as a vaccine. They're just absolutely sure of it. Things could change, but they're pretty sure of it. And that means about 10 months. The problem with this is you don't get it from being around people with COVID. You don't get it from being exposed to COVID. You get it from having COVID. So you get COVID, you get sick, and then you got 10 months of immunity. And to get the next 10 months, you got to get sick again. And I'm as health challenged as anyone in here. I've had all 5 of the shots I needed to have. And I have suffered ill effects from one. I believe it was the second one I took. I had Pfizer all the way, because that's what my doctor recommended the first time, for I don't know why. But that's the thing, is Bill Maher was going on and on. See, I tried to tell you that natural immunity, and nobody on the panel knew that the rest of the story was you don't get that from being exposed to it. You get exposed to measles, you get exposed to that, you might get a light case of it or no case of it. You still might get an immunity to it. But nobody is saying that about COVID now. What they're saying, or nobody that's responsible is saying that. They're saying you got to get it, you got to have it, you got to suffer through it, and then you get your immunity for 10 months. So that is the skeptical sidebar. Now we're going to go on to the member story. This is a story told by one of our members who has something interesting to impart, and it can be about almost anything. And so we're going to Laura Noah.
Thanks, Vern. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Noah, and I'm a new face to some of you today. If I look at all familiar, it may be because you saw me at the last Reason and Rock conference that we had back around 2014 or 15, I think. But I also came to a few events with Sarah Everett back then and got to know Ann Orsi and a few others. But then I got really busy and had a lot going on, and at the time I was still living in Searcy, and so I haven't been back for a while. So got back last month and was like, yeah, these are my people, and I probably I want to get involved. So I grew up in Orange Park, Florida, outside of Jacksonville. Just came back last night from Jacksonville, actually, to see my old birthplace. Even went past the hospital, new name, but same place. And then found myself in Searcy for my freshman year at Harding University. And that's a college affiliated with the Churches of Christ. And I received while I was there, received my MRS degree from, I don't know if you know, that's a Church of Christ joke. That's my marriage license. My MRS degree from John Noah of Amarillo, Texas in 1992. But then I earned my BA in vocal music there at Harding in 93. The following year, I took a job with my collegiate honor society that I joined when I was in college, called Alpha Chi National College Honor Society. And nearly 30 years later, I have continued to work with them and am the executive director of Alpha Chi, which is also a 501c3 that just celebrated its centennial anniversary. I also concurrently now serve as the vice president, was just elected this last weekend, vice president of the Association of College Honor Societies. So maybe I just feel at home with smart people. I have 24-year-old twins, John and Kimberly, who are still my babies. Their dad and I separated around the time they were graduating from high school. And after they were graduated, I decided to get out of Searcy and move to Little Rock. In 2014, I joined, right before I moved, I kind of had an idea I wanted to start moving to the big city. And so I started trying to find groups, and that's kind of how I put Meetup on my phone, because I was like, I'm single, I'm thinking about moving and leaving this town, starting to disconnect, and so I got Meetup on my phone and found Sweet Adelines, and I also found you guys. I ended up getting more involved with Sweet Adelines because it was like a weekly, and it was also musical. So, but I got in with the Top of the Rock Singers. They're a Sweet Adelines chorus here in Little Rock. I don't know if any of you have ever heard any of their performances. They do a lot of stuff around the holidays. Met so many wonderful humans through that and really enjoyed learning and performing a whole new style of music. I was classically trained, grew up singing country music, then classically trained, and then learned barbershop. So kind of don't quite ever know how to sing. And I can't pick one because I love them all because I'm just a music geek. So let's see. In 2016, I helped rebuild the White County Democratic Party, and have been proud to see and stay in touch with them via social media and see that they continue to grow in number and influence. So that's a real point of pride for me. My lovely new wife and life partner and partner in crime now is Sarah Everett. Sarah is an attorney and policy director for the Arkansas ACLU. If you've been following recent state politics, you may have seen her testifying against several backward and discriminatory bills currently running in the Arkansas legislature. In 2019, it seemed fitting that we get married on the steps of that Capitol building in which all of that stuff takes place. And we got married right on the steps of the Capitol in Sunset, and it was beautiful. And we basically honeymooned in the quarantine. So we immediately, within 3 months, I had a back surgery and was just excited to finally get back to work in February and plan a conference and everything for my job. And we all shut down in March and went home. Canceled convention, and I got to spend more time at home. So we both worked from our little apartment and bought a house over here right around the corner in 2020, and we have enjoyed living there ever since. So, surviving the quarantine, we now hope to survive our second Arkansas legislative session together as a married couple. Just a few more months, babe, we can make it. How I came to ASF is a much longer and private story that I am happy to share with anyone off camera in our in-person meetings. But I really appreciate this organization, and I'm looking forward to working together on building this community. And actually last month just joined its board of directors. So kind of bringing maybe fresh eyes to the organization, hopefully once we get through this season, a little more time and bandwidth. I thought I would add a few polarizing possible facts and opinions, just in case you didn't learn enough about me right now. Lizzo is my higher power. I don't know if that may offend someone. I truly enjoy and love and appreciate Nescafe, which is an instant coffee, if you don't know. So it's kind of my jam, that and Coke Zero. I have not received any money from either of those companies to endorse them during this. And also, lastly, I would like to say that the space aliens piloting the spy balloons are actually pretty cool. And, oh wait, there's more. Also, I think I'm going to be putting in an RFP soon to the state of Arkansas for its new potty police force. So I'm hoping to really get some money off the state on that one. And then lastly, I do want to say that I did have my attorney review these statements for me today, and she offered this as something I should close with. The thoughts and opinions expressed today are mine and mine alone, and are not those of ACHS, Alpha Chi, the ACLU, the NSA, the CIA, or any other legal or non-legal entity, or the GOP, the NFL, the NRA, NPR, or SNL. So thank you so much. It was great to get to do this, and I hope to look forward to meeting all of you guys and working with you in the next year.
Thanks, Laura. We need volunteers. Volunteers to do the free thought of the day, which Todd did, the skeptical sidebar that I did, the member story that Laura did. If you have something to say, get a hold of someone on the board, get a hold of somebody somewhere, get a hold of Chris Barecki back here. He's the man that can get you on the speakers list. If you have more than a few minutes to say, we can make you a main speaker. You got to prepare for that, though. And now we come to our main speaker for the day. Our speaker is Dr. Eric Wiebelhaus-Brahm, Associate Professor, School of Public Affairs at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. He's the author of 3 books and over 24 articles and book chapters related to how societies address histories of violence and repression. He studies the politics of memory and justice, anywhere from Arkansas to Uganda. His newest book, written with Elin Skaar and Jemima García-Godos, is that close?
Very close.
Very good. Is called Exploring Truth Commission Recommendations and a Comparative Perspective Beyond Words. So would you please welcome Dr. Eric. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to talk about a relatively narrow area of research for myself that I've been working on. My hopes then is by narrowing in, by talking about some somewhat narrow issues, but also kind of teasing some bigger things for us to think about. And some bigger things that we might want to explore in the Q&A. First of all, I'm going to kind of come up so because we can go to the slides. I'm just going to come around here so I make sure that I'm talking about what's up on the slide. So am I still going to be in? I'm still good in terms of the camera if I move around a little bit.
I can change
okay.
the angle for you.
I didn't know if anybody. Well, I mean everybody else wants to see it as well. So, as Bern said, I'm interested in how societies deal with their past, and I'm a political scientist by training, and so that in that kind of language, I'm interested in the politics about how societies deal with their past, for how justice gets defined, how different groups and societies mobilize to try to pursue different forms of justice, or try to obstruct, those attempts to pursue justice for things that happened in the past. Okay, this is really the center of what my interest is. So what I'm going to talk about today is research that I've done with activists in the Syrian diaspora. So for the last decade, I've done interviews with a variety of activists in the diaspora. I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute if there's some uncertainty there. And exploring how they're trying to realize justice for the atrocities that happened during the course of the civil war over the past more than 10 years now, but also even going back further, the decades of oppression under the Assad regime. So that's what that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about, and in particular, kind of how the factors that shape the kind of the justice needs and demands of Syrians in the diaspora. And what I'm going to focus on is how kind of their positionality, kind of their circumstances shapes kind of what their perceptions of justice. Yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm going to show my stupidity. I don't know what the word diaspora means.
I'll come to that in just a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess if we could go to the next slide, please. So I think before, or I guess after that, we can just move right along. So we have, for those, in a conversation I had during the our get to know each other segment a few minutes ago, I think this might be information that might not be might be pretty widely known here in this room. But the Syrian civil war has created the worst humanitarian crises since World War II. These numbers and these estimates are difficult to get. I mean, they're just really rough estimates, and they're a bit dated now. But it's hard to find anything really more updated. But for a country that before the Civil War started had a population of roughly 20 million people, at its worst, the estimates are, or at its peak, the peak of the Civil War, estimates were that about half of the population had been uprooted from their homes. So we're talking about 10 million people sort of on the move. About half of them are what are legally under international law are called refugees, which means that they were forced to cross the border, to leave Syria. And then about 5 million more are what are called internally displaced people. So they're still within Syria's borders, but have been forced to flee their homes for a variety of reasons. So, massive crisis here. We can move on to the next slide. So my research, what I study is what is often called transitional justice. And so it's, as I said before, it's the pursuit of justice, like some form of justice, and how that gets defined and how it gets implemented in different countries or not implemented. And the transitional adjective gets attached to it because really the academic study and really people in policy circles and activist circles started to pay attention to this when there were democratic transitions happening in Southern Europe in the late 1970s, in Latin America in the 80s, some parts of Asia in the 80s as well, but then we move into the 1990s, many parts of Africa and in Eastern Europe, we're seeing these transitions to democracy. And so often the opportunities and the debates about how to deal with the past often came about as a result of these transitions to democracy, or at least attempted transitions to democracy. So that's why that adjective is there. Now, in the decades since then, often the politics around pursuing and addressing the past has really been divorced from any kind of transition. And we could talk about how there's arguably an international norm that exists out there that states should, and states I mean in the nation state sense, not in like the subnational sense here in the US, should deal with their pasts, and that's sort of like an obligation. And so we often see countries kind of increasingly dealing with their pasts divorced of any kind of real transition. And we see this here in the United States as well. with confronting our past, whether it's histories of racial oppression, legacies of slavery, treatment of indigenous populations, etc. But nonetheless, in academic circles and in policy circles and activist circles, this language of transitional justice still remains very, very common. So just wanted to highlight that there. So we're talking about different ways of dealing with the past, kind of different policies that could be used to deal with the past, and that kind of coincide with different notions of what justice is, whether it's pursuing kind of retributive justice or restorative justice, reparative justice. And again, these are things that I'm happy to talk about what that might look like, how we might define that, if those are things that you're interested in the Q&A. So let's move on to diasporas. So diasporas are groups of people that have some connection to a homeland, but are not currently living there. So if any of you in this room kind of have ancestors, or if you came, or if you're an immigrant to this country, or you're second, third, fourth, whatever, and you have some kind of connection to where your ancestors came from, or if you are an immigrant, where you came from, you would be considered part of that country's diaspora. Okay, so that's what we're talking about with diasporas. So there's a more elaborate definition here. It's lots of academic language here. But in a nutshell, it's someone who has a connection to a homeland, to a motherland, however you want to describe it, and are not currently living within that homeland. Okay, and so what I'm going to talk about today are how Syrians who are outside of Syria, who are in the Syrian diaspora, who are living in the United States, who are living in Europe and other parts of the world, but still feel that connection to Syria, still are interested in justice issues within Syria, and what their interests are. Okay, we can go on to the next slide here. So one of the things that I'll highlight is how these differences in justice somewhat depend on their circumstances, and that's a really important dynamic here. So I have the latter two, or sorry, if we go from bottom to the top, those people who are refugees or IDPs, as internally displaced people, who are still within Syria, but are their homes, their movement has been most recent, right, within the past dozen years, right, as a result of the Civil War. So their preferences and their positions are a bit different from dissidents who have a history of human rights activism, democracy activism within Syria that predates the Civil War. Going back to the aughts, even going back to the 80s or 70s within Syria, but have been forced to flee their homes as a result of oppression by the Syrian regime or the threat of oppression. But they've kind of sought asylum because of persecution over their political activism. And then going back and further, people whose parents or grandparents or great-grandparents left that region. And for those individuals, most of them are what we would call economic migrants, who didn't necessarily leave for political reasons, but left for economic opportunities. It may be going back to the early 1900s, late 1800s, et cetera. And what we see among that group is that for some, it was the Civil War that kind of helped them to kind of reconnect with where they came from, or even to get a sense of and develop a sense of Syrianness and a connection to Syria, because the borders of modern day Syria were created by the British and the French, after World War I, and so for people who left beforehand, they may not have a sense of being Syrian. I mean, it wasn't necessarily. The Greater Syria was a term that was used for that region, but other kinds of terms were also used to describe it, the Greater Palestine, Levant, etc. So for some people who left that region or whose ancestors left that region, for some of them, the Civil War that kind of really helped them kind of reconnect and kind of discover this sense of connection to that homeland. Let's move on, please. So again, here I'm going to dig in a little bit on these different groups and what their perceptions might be, so we can move on to the next slide. Now, for those who are those immigrants or asylum recipients, those who were the dissidents and the second, third generation, et cetera, from the previous slide, have firmer roots within the host country. We might think about host countries where they're living right now. And so they've got firmer, more established roots there. They have, as I already alluded to, they have varied connections to the homeland. And they also have relative economic and physical security. They have those deeper roots, many of them, have jobs, and even though there is some research about the Syrian regime's sort of ability to infiltrate the diaspora, there's still relative physical security here. Whereas those who are refugees and who are IDPs are in very precarious situations. Where we're seeing this again in the wake of the earthquake. Was it 2 weeks ago? No. So they're in a circumstance of tremendous physical and economic insecurity, right? That they're not sure if the communities where they're living, are increasingly kind of unwilling to continue to host them, and so have, and also because of their more recent movement, often have more dense connections to the homeland, issues about property that they may be hoping to go back to if it still exists. So if we can go on to the next slide. Now, a lot of the research that I've done, the interviews with activists over the years, are people who are creating organizations to try to mobilize around justice issues, to try to put pressure on host country governments, put pressure on the Syrian government as well, to try to address the past. Now, many of these organizations, I think we can, and this is just a smattering of some of the examples of organizations that are out there. We can move on to the next slide. Now, what these activists did, I spent a couple of slides talking about their activism, how that's changed over the course of the last decade plus. So when the Civil War happened, if you remember back that far, there was a lot of anticipation that the Civil War would be over very quickly, and that the Assad regime would lose. There would be a revolution. So what happened in this interim period was they had a lot of activists that were really enthusiastic about the prospect of dealing with Syria's past quite quickly. There were a lot of governments, in the United States, in Europe, and other parts of the world that also thought that this would be a time where there would be an ability to deal with Syria's past pretty quickly. So there was a flood of money that was pouring in from governments, from activists, from people in the Syrian community to support these kind of initiatives. And so there was a lot of money that was out there, and what that meant was that there were the proliferation of organizations that had lots of different visions about what kind of aspects of the past here, whether to focus on going back to the 1980s, whether to focus on the repression in 2011, and how to, what should be prioritized, and how the past should be dealt with. There are differences in terms of, well, should there be more of a focus on prosecuting Assad and members of the regime? Should there be more of a focus on reparation? It's like trying to bring individuals who had suffered oppression kind of back to the extent that was possible to their circumstances where they were at before that happened? Should there be more of a focus on trying to engage in truth, kind of seeking kind of initiatives to uncover information about what happened? the fates of loved ones and why things happen. So there's some disagreement about that. There was some disagreement about, or there was some divisions among activists based on what part of the country of Syria that they came from, what their ethnic identity is. Kurds sometimes had somewhat different visions than what Arabs had, Arab Syrians. So all of these things, aside from the money that was out there, led to the proliferation of lots of different groups who articulated different kinds of visions about what should happen. And there wasn't a whole lot of what the slide calls horizontal collaboration between these different activists. There was a lot of money out there, and so they tended to create their own visions about what the future should look like and what justice should look like. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. Then, as we know, kind of looking at this history, the civil war dragged on much longer than was anticipated. The Russian government and the Iranian government got more decisively involved in the regime than allies of rebel groups and opposition groups. The insecurity that was created by the fighting in Syria created power vacuums in parts of the country that transnational Islamic extremists, mainly through Islamic State, were able to find roots in different parts of the country, and then, as you recall, Islamic State sort of expanded its reach in parts of the country where there was more of a governance vacuum. So then what you saw was that much of the international community shifted its attention from being focused on questions of justice to be focused on fighting Islamic extremism and trying to deal with the humanitarian fallout of the explosion of the civil war and the humanitarian crisis that unfolded. So then the focus became less on justice and more on trying to mitigate the impact of the civil war on the rest of the world. Right? Trying to deal with the humanitarian fallout, trying to deal with the refugees that came about. So these and simultaneously, sorry, I was getting ahead of the slide here. The activists themselves were able then to form these. Let's stay here for a second. So they're also able to connect with transnational activists, lawyers who specialize in these kinds of things, who are based in different parts of the world, in order to advance their causes. Now we can go to the slide, which I've pretty much already talked about. What I didn't talk about, though, was that even though what was the consequence for activists? So as that money for justice started to dry up, you saw organizations to engage in other kinds of activities. Some of them got more involved in the delivery of humanitarian aid, within Syria. Others, were advising, trying to provide advice to other governments about how to get involved and to try to. There's disagreement about the desirability of military intervention, but some are very much pro trying to get the United States and other countries more decisively involved against the Assad regime. But throughout all this, some activists, actually were just not able to continue anymore, as these resources started to dry up. But nonetheless, the collaboration between groups was still relatively limited. For those groups that were still around, they had been able to collect data on atrocities that were happening in different parts of the country where they still had links with people who were still within Syria. And those kinds of that data that they had, that evidence that they had, was their currency, was their ability to maintain relevance and to attract resources. So those sharing that data was somewhat that created obstacles for sharing that data, because it was the asset that they had in a sense. So Syrian activists to think about again more humanitarian delivery of aid, thinking about longer term issues about justice and the prospects of how do they put things in place to maybe hold individuals accountable a decade from now, maybe 2 decades from now. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. But for those whose positions are much more precarious, their needs are much more focused on alleviating or addressing economic circumstances and economic uncertainty. They're less focused on kind of civil and political rights kind of issues that, well, frankly, we tend to focus on more here in the United States. So we can move on to the next slide. Now, I want to preface this by saying that when people are in these situations of precarity, when they're refugees or internally displaced within Syria, it's difficult to find out what they really think. Right? That they're in circumstances where they might not want to give a truthful answer, right? And it may be difficult for people to get to these communities anyway to even ask them in the first place, or it may be very dangerous to do that. So I want to preface, what comes next by saying, might not be all that certain what they really think. So we can move on to the next slide. But for these, what surveys and what the data that it does exist suggests is that they're much more concerned about peace, and that they see that the pursuit of justice might come at a trade-off for peace, that it may perpetuate violence. They tend, they do, the one study says that it's not that they don't want justice, but maybe that might have to come later. And also the groups are much more focused on issues around property, around reparation. They're anticipating that they're going to be going home and maybe forced to go home more than they're ready for. So for many refugees and internally displaced people, what they're most concerned about is, what do we do about property? Property that's been destroyed, or for people who have been forced to flee their homes. Sometimes other people have come and are living there, where it's still possible to live. Those individuals may or may not be aware of the lines of property ownership, right? So I don't want to suggest that people who might be occupying their homes have necessarily stolen their property. They might not know, right, what the history of that property is. With the destruction of records and government offices, it may be very difficult for people to prove that they own a piece of property. So these kinds of very tangible issues are much more on the minds of IDPs and refugees. Let's move on to the next slide. This is just a recent, well, not so recent law now that the Syrian government passed and really what it does, this is just something that was produced by an activist group around it, but what the law is meant to try to do is to incentivize people to come back. So, this is an embarrassment for the regime. It's also an economic liability for people to be displaced. So the regime wants to encourage people to come back home and kind of resume the normal life and start to rebuild. And so what this law did, and it hasn't been fully implemented, but it's kind of like a sword of Damocles that's been put over people's heads, try to encourage them to come back. But if they don't come back, then this law gives the state the power to basically take over property and to redevelop it, or to turn it over to developers to do new things with it, to start to rebuild. Right? So again, the implementation of this has actually been really slow-rolled, and is not, but it's something that could be put into place at any time. So this is something that IDPs and refugees are thinking about. So just a couple of things to wrap up. I rambled on for too long and wanted to start chatting about things that jump out at you as being interesting. So let's move on with a couple of thoughts. So one of the things that organizations, have been able to pivot and provide this humanitarian assistance to deal with this need. We have the activists have also been really successful at documenting atrocities that have gone on, and we're starting to see some of this being used. So the universal jurisdiction prosecution are so basically this is an area of international law where it allows the prosecution of crimes, or gives gives domestic courts the ability to prosecute certain crimes regardless of where they happened or who the accused is, what their nationality is. Okay, so crime, in international law, war crimes, crimes against humanity, torture, piracy, these are crimes that the world is basically seen as crimes that are so heinous that any state has an obligation to prosecute them regardless of where they happened or who did it or who the accused is. Okay. So what we're starting to see are some cases, the ones that have been the most advanced are in Germany, where Syrians have been on trial for atrocities happening in Syria. So again, Syrians on trial for crimes that occurred in Syria, the prosecutions are happening in German courts. Okay, so that's where this universal jurisdiction. So a couple of those have already been underway, and others are sort of making their way in Europe. There's this thing called the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism that's also been created by the United Nations. And what this is the analogy is imperfect, but it's sort of like, some people kind of analogize it as being like a prosecutor's office or even like a grand jury kind of thing, where it's collecting evidence, and again, it's a transnational body, it's part of the United Nations, that then it's this body of evidence that then could potentially be used to prosecute people down the road. Let's go to the next slide. So that's out there, and it exists. Hasn't done a whole lot yet. Still relatively new. Again, just to kind of sum up the argument I was trying to make throughout the slide. So what Syrians think about these things have been shaped by their ability to get funding and to draw attention to their concerns, by how secure their situation is, by how precarious their situation is, and their relationship to home. And we can go on to the last slide. And I just figured I would highlight how the earthquake of a couple of weeks ago kind of lends kind of renewed urgency for Syrians anyway, but in terms of the humanitarian crisis and the new property damage that has happened as a result of the civil war. So thanks very much for your patience and your attention. So let's chat about whatever draws your attention.
I got a question for you. And a lot of us know this or don't know this, but the problems in Syria have been so diverse for so many years. And so you have several different languages that are spoken there. You have several different religions that are there. It originally started out as Christian, and it has morphed into numerous religions there. If we're talking about the United States getting involved, and actually we've put several $1 billion into Syria, but getting more involved into humanitarian issues, how are we addressing that when we are also involved in the military issues behind it? Because we're like in Afghanistan, in Iraq, we are ending up causing as many problems as we are then trying to put Band-Aids on.
I think there are a variety of ways to explore that question. I think that from a U.S. government perspective, it has different interests, and those different interests are represented by different parts of the bureaucracy. Right? And so there are questions about how, there's kind of technical questions about how the Department of Defense, other kinds of intelligence agencies, State Department, USAID, which manages the U.S.'s foreign assistance, the official assistance. But then, I mean, that's not really what you're asking about, right? I mean, what you're asking about is the broader moral question, and I think.
What's going on now, you've got Iran and Russia involved. You have Iran and Russia involved also in Ukraine. It's almost like we're. Oh, what's it?
There's a microphone.
Oh, it's almost like it's more militarily involved than it is humanitarian involved. We are displacing and creating these problems. It's like with the earthquake. We're hearing all of the information from Turkey, very, very little coming from Syria. And that's an Assad issue. But if you're taking a look, if you go all the way back to Iraq, we've actually created more problems in these Middle Eastern countries than we have solved. And we're setting back, trying to put Band-Aids on broken legs that we have created and that other countries have created. Would it not be more advantageous to allow the people to morph into their own type of civil war to create their own means to a better end?
You mean like to let them fight it out? Or
Technically speaking, I mean, there's a lot of things where we're looking at these altruistic things, where we're looking at humanitarian issues, but at the same time we're creating wars. We're dropping bombs, and then we're taking tanks, and we're doing this. It's almost as if we're not allowing people to make amends for themselves. We're imposing our own belief systems in an area where their belief systems are totally different than ours. And is it wrong that, and I'm not talking about Assad now because he's crook, but we're involved in these things, and we're looking at all of these other countries bringing in all these immigrants, and it is such a financial tragedy for a lot of these other countries. Even the prosecution issues, how do you prosecute? I mean, what effect does that happen? I mean, if you have somebody from Syria and then you're prosecuting them in Germany, do you actually have the person there?
Yeah, in those examples. Yeah, so, I mean, there's a lot of directions to go in your question. And, there are arguments that are made of critiques of outside intervention in civil wars, and there's some that argue that we do just need to let them fight it out, and that interfering is not going to be helpful. I mean, that obviously raises its own sort of moral and ethical questions as well.
But those are moral and ethical questions that we pose. You see what I'm saying? If we have,
yeah, I mean, if we
had urban civil war here, and yeah, we did have some intervention from France and from Spain and from other countries. But if we would have had all of these other countries coming in, we lost a quarter of our population or more here in the United States. But we found an end. Where I'm looking at these Middle Eastern countries, and all of these Western European countries are getting involved in this dynamic that we really don't understand. And it looks to me like, if you're looking at the course of the last 100 years, really in Syria, well, it started back in the 1800s all the way through, it's transitioned. I mean, you had Russia with them and France with them and everybody else. It's getting worse, not better. And it's outside intervention, in my view, that might be creating that problem.
I mean, that might be. I mean, it's a fairly common argument. I don't know that. I mean, for the U.S. just to pull out entirely and not be engaged in the region is unlikely to be helpful.
We did that in Afghanistan, and look what happened. But we got involved and created a lot of problems first. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We come in, we think we're democratizing countries that really, technically speaking, we might be better off to just leave them evolve into their own assimilation, their own unique circumstance. Not everybody in the world can be like the United States.
I mean,
But
yeah, I mean, they arguably
you've
shouldn't
got
be.
other foreign powers coming in, like Russia, to enforce their ideas on these people. And so the people do not really have the opportunity to do their own thing. So are we supposed to sit by and watch this happen and do nothing? Like we did in Germany, where we sit by and didn't do anything or get active in any of it until we were actually attacked by Japan. So what do you do? It's a moral quandary. We can't be the world police.
No, I can't.
And other countries have to activate or be interested in helping, or hands off and let countries we do not like take over.
I mean, at the end of the day, we live in a world that's made up of sovereign states, and the governments of those states, they're accountable to their people. They're not accountable to humanity as a whole. And so, inevitably, the policies that they pursue are what they think are in the best interest of their country. Not what's necessarily in the best interest of whatever country we're talking about.
So I have a question, and thank you for everything. It was very enlightening. So there was an independent thing that you commission or something that's international. You said it was a transnational thing. How does that differ from like The Hague? Can you explain a little bit more about that? Because I'm interested to hear, how did that start? When did that start? And what is the potential for that for, dealing with crimes and problems as we seem to just be, they're compounding and compounding. I'd love to hear some more about that.
Sure. So I think by The Hague, I think you're probably talking about the International Criminal Court.
Yes.
Which, I mean, there are lots of courts in The Hague. But the International Criminal Court is, I don't want to assume knowledge in the room, but it was a court that's been around since 2002, and it's meant to hold individuals accountable, for the war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. When I talked about those universal jurisdiction crimes earlier, I think I forgot to mention genocide. But it's charged, the International Criminal Court of the ICC that's its focus, is to try to hold individuals accountable. Now, the way the court is set up, it's meant, it has the ability to assert jurisdiction in 3 different circumstances. One is if a state party, which is the language that international lawyers use to describe states that have ratified a treaty. So there's a treaty that created the International Criminal Court. So one of the ways in which the International Criminal Court could investigate a situation like Syria, for example, would be for states to refer it. And for there to be, it was involving a state party. So, that the alleged crime occurred in the territory of a state party, or that the accused is a state party. Syria doesn't fall in either of those categories. Syria is not interested in the ICC, is not a party to that treaty that created it. The second way in which the ICC could get involved would be through the United Nations Security Council. So when the treaty was being negotiated to create this court, the United Nations Security Council has the power, or like its job is to maintain international peace and security. Right. I mean, we can debate about whether it does a good job of that, but that's what its job is on paper. Now, so there was concern that this court would potentially disrupt peace processes. And so this is a criticism that's leveled about the court and other attempts to pursue justice when conflict is still ongoing. The concern is that if leaders are threatened with prosecution, that might give them an incentive to try to fight till the end. And this is an argument that's made about Gaddafi in Libya, that he fought to the bitter end because he thought that his future would be just to be prosecuted and spend the rest of his life in jail. So a second path that cases could come before the court is through the United Nations Security Council asking the court to investigate something. And so the thought was that if the Security Council was involved, then that would alleviate those fears among the Security Council members about the ICC mucking up things. So that's one potential path. But as most of you probably know, the UN Security Council has the permanent 5 members, who are the big 5 victors of World War II. The U.S., UK, France, China, and now Russia. And then there are 10 non-permanent members. Now, any of those 5 permanent members can veto any decision of the Security Council. So since Assad's regime is a strong ally in Russia, that path is not viable. Because Russia would veto any attempt to refer the situation there. The third possibility is that there actually is a mechanism for the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to launch an investigation on his or her authority. So theoretically, that could be done, but it's also a very politically dicey thing for a prosecutor to do when the political support for the court is still, it's still a very new institution, fundamentally dependent upon states for its budget. It's fundamentally reliant upon states to apprehend individuals and to collect testimony. So the prosecutor has tended to not want to get involved in politically contentious situations, which Syria obviously would be. So there's not really, those are the 3 paths for the ICC to get involved. Neither of them is really viable when it comes to Syria. So that's why this triple IM that was on the slide toward the end was created. It was actually the impetus of the UN General Assembly. It was, if I remember right, I think it was the United Arab Emirates and Switzerland. There were a couple of countries, the General Assembly, that mobilized to create this body. And so, like I said, it's now out there. It's serving as sort of a warehouse for evidence, if you will. And it also has the ability to kind of basically construct legal cases, right? So that it could then basically turn over to some court, whether it's a domestic court or an international court. Because one other option, which is sometimes floated around, is to create some kind of what's often called an ad hoc court. Some of you may remember in the 1990s there was an international criminal tribunal for the former Yugoslavia that was created to prosecute people who committed atrocities there. There was a similar one created for Rwanda after the Rwandan genocide in '94. So that would actually be another kind of option, would create a whole new different court temporarily to deal with Syria. That has its own set of problems, like creating the political will and the resources to create something totally new. So probably what will happen for the foreseeable future will be these cases in domestic courts through universal jurisdiction, like the German examples. And so this triple IM could contribute to allowing prosecutors in domestic courts or domestic judicial systems to construct cases against individuals.
I'm kind of intrigued by the trade-offs that are, implicit between ending the wars that are creating the human rights abuses and the poverty and all the other ills, and justice. And I'm intrigued by, I've thought about what you said before, is that, if you're a regime, a person in a dictatorship, for example, you have only the choice to win and escalate within your own country, because you can't flee your country. They'll prosecute you, and you'll end up spending your life in jail or at the end of a rope. So I was wondering, if we cared 100% about, the population's well-being, and if we cared 0% about justice, then maybe the solution we would say is, okay, the top 100 people of your regime will give you $2 million, a new identity, citizenship in the United States, and a mansion. If you take the offer, then you just decapitated the regime for way cheaper than any military option, but you've completely given up on justice. You may have shortened the war by 5 years, but you've completely given up on justice, and maybe it saves some six-figure number of people's lives. And I was wondering, can democracies make trade-offs like that and just completely give up on justice if it's the thing holding up the process of solving a problem?
It's a really interesting observation, Chris, and critics point to that having this norm that countries need to deal with their past can actually be counterproductive. That it disincentivizes leaders to step down. And so if we think back to Duvalier in Haiti, who was it the late 70s or early 80s, agreed to step down and then went into exile in the south of France. Those things used to be relatively common, but now it's becoming more and more difficult for countries to do that. Ben Ali, the former president of Tunisia, is now in exile in Saudi Arabia, but a lot of the places that might have been attractive, like to go to France, it's not possible anymore. Because, the French wouldn't let them in, but even if they did, then they'd be at risk of facing court challenges, within French courts. So having that out, of having them go, Marcos came to the U.S., from the Philippines. Those things are really not that possible, or where they are possible are maybe places that are less desirable for leaders to want to go and live. Assad probably could go to Russia, but, St. Petersburg isn't the same as living in Nice or something like that. It's not quite as attractive. It's really kind of normatively impossible, really, to do that kind of thing now. Another part of your question was thinking about different forms of justice. And maybe, I think in the United States, we're as a society, we're very focused on retributive justice, right? You just have to turn on the television and see that, right? Look at the dramas, not, let alone the news programs. So, but, we could think about justice taking different forms, and countries around the world have sort of made these compromises where, in order to bring about change, they decided to forego, punishing people, and have done different kinds of things, whether it's other kinds of transitional justice kind of policies include things like engaging in vetting kind of processes, where they're not facing jail time, but maybe their past is scrutinized, and maybe they're not allowed to run for office if they've got some kind of human rights violations in their background, or maybe they're not allowed to work for the state anymore. Those things have their own problems. After the U.S. invaded Iraq, they engaged in a form of vetting, which ended up leaving the authorities without security personnel and without people who had the technical expertise to keep the electricity and the sewers flowing. So those are sometimes problematic. Countries are sometimes engaged in what are called truth commissions. If you've heard of them, you've probably heard of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where the purpose is not to punish people, but to have people tell stories, to try to uncover information about what happened, to engage in truth-telling and truth-seeking. So that might be something that societies could do. Try to engage in different kinds of reparations and creating memorials to the past, or different kinds of transitional justice policies that could be implemented. So these are the kinds of things that theoretically Syrians could talk about and could engage in. And some of these things might not be super controversial. I mean, I don't know. I think the Syrian government right now is in a strong enough position that it probably feels like it doesn't have to kind of negotiate on any of these justice terms. So, yeah. Did I cover different parts of the question?
Yes,
Bernie,
thanks.
I've seen your hand.
In 1985, President Carter published a book called The Blood of Abraham. And for someone that didn't know a whole lot about the Middle East like me, that was a very instructive book, and he was writing it from a perspective that hardly anyone else could. He had met all these people. Before the current President Assad, there was a 7-month president, and before that was Assad's father for a long time. Carter said that Assad's father did not care who won in the Middle East as long as he got to stay in charge of his country, and whatever peace settlement came about, he got credit for. He wanted to be one of the people that they credited with doing this. What do you think about that?
I'll preface it by saying I'm not an expert in Syrian politics. I study justice mobilization. So I think that the regime. I think that makes sense in that the regime. Pretty much every regime kind of craves international credibility, right? And so to engage in policies that they anticipate are going to increase that.
I think he was saying that the problem with that was Assad would never take a stand one way or the other to force anybody else to do anything. He just wanted to be there and get the credit when it finally happened.
Yeah, there also is. Kind of built into that too is concerns about sovereignty, and one of the things that many countries are concerned about. All countries probably are concerned about outside interference, right? And so that also means that they're not just in their own affairs, but that also leads them to often be sensitive about intervention in other places as well, right? Because then that creates a precedent, and if this happens more and more frequently, then that leads to more of an endorsement that then could be then turned upon them in the future, right? This is part of many countries' concerns about intervention in internal affairs. So yeah, I think that's probably a good assessment.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me.
All righty. Upcoming events. We have got Pint Night that is supposed to be held tomorrow. As of right now, I have no one coming. If no one decides they want to go, we will move that again to the next month. But it's downtown at, sorry?
How do you sign up for that?
Go to meetup.com. Meetup.com and look for this little picture that says Pint Night on it. And
That would be on the Arkansas Society of Free Thinkers on Meetup, right?
Yes. How are we registered there? Is it Arkansas Society of Free Thinkers?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So look at meetup.com and look for Arkansas Society of Free Thinkers. And Pint Night is Basically, we sit, we have a snack and a pint and plot world domination. We have a lot of things on Meetup. The best thing to do is go to Meetup. Make Meetup part of your at least weekly troll through the internet, because there's a lot of things there. We have a secular addiction group. Am I saying that right? Secular addiction? It's to overcome addiction without resorting to a higher power.
I want to keep my skeptical of my secular addictions.
There you go. If you'd like to join the Arkansas Society of Freethinkers, go to arfreethinkers.org, arfreethinkers.org, and you can find information on how to donate, how to show up at these meetings, and it's going to refer you to Meetup too, I think. We're looking for a way to put that calendar on the website so it's real obvious what's going on. If you would like to host a potluck, a book club, a families meetup, anything like that, a singles meetup, anything you got, give Chris a call, give me a call, give Jim a call. Anyone can help you do that. It's really easy. And if you'd like to volunteer, if you have some particular skill, we're still looking for website help. Still looking for help on the website. We've tried to hire people and can't hire. If you have audio, video, or video, maybe we could do one or the other and do sign language.
And we can also use people that are interested in helping with the audio video presentation.
There you go. That was Jim Lindsley, who is running the audio video. By the way, we're trying some new things with our streaming today that we've not ever done before. And so if it looks kind of wacky, that's why.
Thank you, Bern.
Amazingly complicated. I'm very impressed.
It truly is. And
I'd like to say one thing, that
Okay.
Brian Shank has helped tremendously, and he's been the guy that's been running this mostly today. So give him a big applause.
out of the corner of my eye, I can see the television screen, and it's disconcerting to me while I'm up here. And so I very helpfully moved it so that the speaker couldn't see it when he needed to. Folks, that is it. We appreciate you coming, and next month, what is our date next month, Chris?
It'd be the same.
It's the third Sunday of every month, and that should be,
Yeah, February and March are always the same.
is that right?
Yeah, let's sleep.
Let's see.
And that'll be next year.
19th, so March 19th, do we have a speaker lined up?
I don't believe so. We had a problem with the speaker we were going to do, so if anyone has a suggestion, we are all ears.
Yes, come, speak.
Watch me up for the...
Become famous. This, people make fun of it, but really and truly, anything you put on the internet goes out worldwide, and people all over the world can see it. And this is going out on the internet thanks to Jim Lindsley. Thanks for coming. We appreciate you.
If you'd like to know more about the Arkansas Society of Freethinkers, check us out online at arfreethinkers.org. You can also find us on Meetup, Facebook, and on YouTube. At Arkansas Society of Freethinkers, people are accepted as human beings and are never threatened with eternal damnation. In a nutshell, a freethinker believes there are no imaginary gods whose dogma is sent to control the human race. Rather, we are all human beings responsible for our own actions and our own future. Check us out at any of the following online locations. Send us an email and let's talk. Or go to Meetup and join us at any of our regularly scheduled events. Let's get together and hope to see you soon.